Did Miss Cobel just confirm that Gemma is secretly an Egan? I think so. Because in this episode, when Miss Cobel sneaks Mark and Devin into the birthing cabins, under the cover that Devin is one of Jame Egan's mistresses, the security guard immediately buys the cover, which proves to us that Jame has had multiple mistresses, which supports the idea that he could have secret children. So in the case of Gemma, Jame Egan,
you are the father.
I think that was established back in episode 4 of this season, the Orthbo episode, when they were talking about Dieter Egan. If you guys remember, Mr. Milchick was reading the story about Kier Egan and his twin brother Dieter, and in that story, there was a metaphor about Dieter Egan spilling himself on the soil. Helly made the joke that it was just about masturbation, but if we look deeper into it, I think it's actually a metaphor about spreading your seed, which is what the Egan family bloodline has been doing, and that's how it ties into Gemma being an Egan. It gets even more interesting if you think about Gemma, Mark, and Helly being all around the same age. Gemma and Helly could actually be sisters, and that could explain their weird attraction to Mark and why Jame Egan decided to visit Helly R at the end of the episode. But we're going to dive deeper into Jame and Helly's storyline a little later in the video, because I think his confronting of Helly actually confirms all this and brings it all full circle. And it's not just Miss Cobel's comments about Jame having mistresses, it's also Mr. Milchick's comments when he was talking to Miss Huang earlier. First things first, let's talk about the fact that Miss Huang's name is actually Eustace. So let's click the subscribe button one time for Miss Eustace Huang. I've never heard a girl named Eustace before. But more specifically though, Mr. Milchick mentioned something when he was talking to Miss Huang. He told Miss Huang that they would be moving her out of her parents' house in a similar manner in which they moved Miss Cobel out of her mother's house when Miss Cobel lived with her mom and her aunt. There was never any mention of a father for Miss Cobel, and I don't think there's any mention of a father for Miss Huang as well, which I think could tie into the fact that Miss Huang is also part of that same bloodline. Because if we look at Gemma and we look at Miss Huang, they're both Asian, and for some reason they have some connection to Lumen that's just inexplicable.
Oh yeah, it's all coming together.
And all of this ties into Cold Harbor. And in this episode, Miss Cobel also told us Gemma will die if Mark had completed Cold Harbor. But what does she mean by Gemma will die? Because she tells Mark, and I quote, "If you've already finished the file, that means she's already dead," which means that once Cold Harbor is done, Gemma will die. But I don't think she means the literal physical death. That doesn't make any sense if Lumen is actually trying to create something. But if they're trying to erase Gemma's identity, it starts to make more sense, because Gemma is going through a bunch of different series of tests, and in every test she has to go through Severance, and during those tests Dr. Maurer is monitoring her to see what she remembers and what she doesn't. What I think is going on is they're trying to kill the Audi version of Gemma in the same way that they killed the Innie versions of Irving back in episode 4. The same episode where the whole concept of Dieter Egan and spreading your seed first was introduced in Severance, which that episode tied into the fact that Gemma could be a secret Egan. So we start to see how episode 4 might have been dropping a bunch of more Easter eggs than we thought initially. It's also the same death that Dylan had in this episode. Dylan's Innie quit because of the relationship that he was having with his Audi's wife. I think it's best if I say lack of a relationship that he had, because he did not get the relationship that he wanted with his Audi's wife. And the same way that Irving died is the same way that he died. Once you go through Severance and you go back to your Audi and you never become an Innie again, it's essentially the same thing as dying. So could this be what's about to happen to Gemma? They're trying to erase her Audi's life and give her a new life as an Egan. Would that be James' way of replacing Helly? I don't know if you noticed, but in this episode, Mr. Drummond was really on about the fact that they were supposed to complete Cold Harbor today. And not just the fact that he was on about it, in the same very episode, Jame Egan was in the Lumen offices. I'm assuming that he was waiting for Cold Harbor to be finished so he could actually see what was going to happen with Gemma. I feel as though this entire episode, even the title After Hours, is about the death and the quitting and or crumbling of Lumen, because this episode made me feel like Mr. Milchick is going to quit as well, which I think adds to the theme of mental death, because Mr. Milchick reached his breaking point after Mark did not come into work and Mr. Drummond humiliated Milchick, forcing him to apologize for using the word remonstration. Mr. Milchick finally snaps and tells Drummond to devour feculence, which means eat shit. And that was him standing up for himself, because this entire season we've seen Mr. Milchick feel uneasy about his place in Lumen right when they gave him the Cure Egan pictures. If you take the assimilation into the Egan bloodline literally and you see how they turned Mr. Milchick, a black man, into Cure Egan, you can start to see how the Egans themselves like to spread their seed around. But it wasn't just Drummond that pushed him to his breaking point. It was also losing control over Dylan, which I think really affected Mr. Milchick, because now I'm starting to think that Milchick was really sincere when he did what he did for Dylan by inviting his Audi wife in here and giving Dylan special treatment. Dylan completely disrespected Milchick after quitting, showing that even the workers don't fear him. He had to exert his power and dominance over Miss Huang, a child, so he could feel some semblance of power. For someone like Mr. Milchick, who's been a loyal Lumen employee, this has never happened before. I feel like it took Mark calling in, and in that conversation, it finally made Mr. Milchick realize that there's more to life than working for Lumen. You could see his reaction after the phone call with Mark. You could see how he's ruminating it all. And if Mr. Milchick quits, I feel like Lumen will fall. Mr. Milchick has been the enforcer of the entire Severance system on the floor, and we still haven't seen that scene from the trailer where he unbuttons his tie and walks out, hinting that he may be quitting. And who is going to keep the workers in check? More specifically, who's going to keep Mark in check? We've already seen Miss Cobel betray Lumen. Could Mr. Milchick be next to betray Lumen as well? But I think the most important question in this entire episode is what it ends on. What does Jame Egan want from Annie Helly? At the end of the episode, Annie Helly was trying to figure out a way to get into the export hall, but her father, Jame Egan, actually came into the severed floor through the export hall. This is the second direct meeting with Annie Helly and her Audi's father. The first time they met was at the end of season 1. At the time, Jame didn't realize that it was Helly's Annie, but I think throughout this season, if you guys remember in episode 2 when he called her fetid moppet, or when Drummond forced Helly to go back into the severed floor and Helly had asked them would her father be joining them and they told her no. So there's a clear divide and distinction between Helena and her father. However, for some reason, he feels connected to Annie Helly in a way that he's not connected to her Audi. But what he says to her about the fact that she had him fooled, I think that has something to do with Gemma as well. If you guys remember earlier in the season when Helena met with Mark's Audi in the restaurant, she purposely said Gemma's name wrong to trigger Mark. I feel like there's some form of animosity there. If Helly feels like she never lived up to her father's expectations and now her father's trying to transform Gemma into an Egan to replace Helly, could it be that's why she's forcing Gemma to go through Cold Harbor? And in that way, Miss Cobel could have been right by saying if Mark had completed Cold Harbor, Gemma would be dead. Is that Helly's way, once they found out that Gemma was an Egan, of her getting Gemma out of the picture so that her father has to love her? Because Helena is really trying to get her father's attention, but he's not giving it to her at all. Another thing that I found really interesting is the fact that Jame Egan came up through the export hall, meaning that there's another way inside of the Lumen offices that gets you onto the severed floor. At first, I thought it was the elevator that everybody else went through, but if he can get through there through the severed hall, that means there's another way for him to enter that entire domain as a whole. But that's just my thoughts. I'd love to hear your thoughts about it in the comment section below. Guys, if you like this video, give it a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button, and until next time, peace.